Okay, aloha. Nice to see you today. We will continue our discussion with a couple of things here, I guess. The Industrial Revolution. I think that this subject today, the person of our discussion today, much of his thoughts are a result of the negatives of industrialization as we saw them occur. You can see that his lifetime is as the industrialization is getting started and really has moved to mainland Europe. You can see he's a German, I believe, yep, there he is. He's a German gentleman. And then Marxism became super popular. And then there was a time period, relatively at least recently, where Marxism was, everybody was off of that. Nobody liked it. But isn't it fascinating that is now, sort of as we're watching things happening, Marxism is having a resurgence. So let's discuss the topic, shall we? Here we go. You need a blank piece of paper to write this down. Marx is the principal author of a famous book called The Communist Manifesto. And he wrote it in 1848 when he was a 30-year-old guy, and he co-wrote it with a guy named Friedrich Engels. All right, and look, we don't call it Engelsism, do we? We call it Marxism. All right, so there's, how important was Friedrich Engels? He was pretty important. He was a wealthy friend of Marx. Marx, probably closest associate most of his adult life was Friedrich Engels, and Friedrich Engels, frankly, was a wealthy friend that helped Marx maintain a life as a writer and philosopher. All right, so now, what is the main theme of the Communist Manifesto? Well, it has to do with the concept of class. That's the main thing that it has to do with. And Marx basically said that if you study history, so Marx's book is sort of divided into a couple of parts. The first part is he's sort of talking about looking back at history. And then the second part is he's looking forward. He's looking forward about what should happen. So he basically says, well, if you study history, what you'll discover is that anything, any place, any time period you sort of study is a discussion of the struggle between classes. We sort of maybe think about the helots and the homoioi in Sparta. How about that? We could think about the patricians and the plebeians in ancient Rome. Certainly those are examples that would be legitimate, but he said the best example of all of history was something that ultimately in the life of Marx was not that long ago. Marx was born 3 years after Napoleon was defeated at Waterloo. He saw, we were talking about Les Miserables, right? And Les Miserables, the movie and the play, whatever, was this continuation of the difficulties France went through, and he observed that in his lifetime. And we're talking about 100 years into the Industrial Revolution, and much of the continent of Europe is really getting industrialized at this time during his life. Okay, and so let's go back to the French Revolution again. You remember this? Remember this long word, the bourgeoisie? All right, the bourgeoisie was that sort of middle class, even though there weren't that many of them. Remember, they were in the third estate of France, and the bourgeoisie were wealthier people in the third estate who sort of emerged as leaders. And so what Marx says, hey, take a look at France. Well, the middle class helped the poor class kick out the noble class. Oh yeah. Don't forget to mention they did it violently. And of course we discussed that. We went through that very deeply. We discussed the Reign of Terror, etc. So now, what is the future? What does the future hold now according to this book? Well, there's a continuation. There will be a continuation of this theme. Remember, the theme is the struggle between classes. Okay, so in France, for example, we kicked out one class. All right, we kicked out the noble class. There's still classes, he would argue. And the two classes are, the lower class still exists, and then you have this bourgeoisie class. And he stuck with that name. All right, and so he gives the lower class a new name. He calls it the proletariat, calls them the proletariat. And the proletariat is the big, massive group of people who are, for lack of a better way of putting it, the workers, as he observes it happening in his home country of Germany, certainly, and throughout the rest of Europe, even in the United States. He keeps the word the bourgeoisie. Right? So in other words, even though the noble class is gone, right, let's scratch that out, there's still classes. Okay, so the lower class and the upper class, the proletariat and the bourgeoisie still exist. And since there's always still a struggle, what are we going to see happening? This struggle between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. And just like the noble class, the upper class got kicked out, eventually the bourgeoisie is going to get kicked out. Why? Well, the poor never are going to make it, is basically his argument. So fine, we've eliminated the nobility, the people who maintain wealth generation after generation, family wealth. Okay, we're eliminating that. But now what we've got is we've got a capitalistic system in which we have the wealth centered on people who control these new industries that we see rising above us, and the poor people, certainly those bourgeoisie are going to get rich, but the poor are going to stay poor. All right? And the products that the poor make, the products that the poor people produce in these industrialized factories, they're never ever going to be able to buy these products, even the products that they produce, these finished products that they may produce in their own factory where they work. They're never going to be able to purchase those things because they're so poor. And then eventually what happens? Well, you're going to have goods stockpile. Eventually you've got the factory has got to come to a stop making these things. Nobody's buying things. All right? And if you have to stop the production of goods, what does that mean? You have to let the workers, you have to lay off the workers. You have to you have to stop letting people come to work. People can't come to work anymore. All right? Remember, this is a future prediction that he's having. And so now, not only are they poor, now they're going to get poorer because they're not going to work. And so what will the workers do? Well, they'll revolt. All right? So remember the French Revolution to get rid of the noble class. Here, we've got the workers' revolution to get rid of the capitalists, the ownership, the owner class. How's that sound? So, again, this is, and Marx makes no bones about the fact that this should happen. Not only should it happen, but when it does happen, it should be a violent thing. All right? And the workers will take control of, for example, the factories, like we're talking about at this time period, the means of production. And they're going to create a brand new system. And it's going to be a system in which the production of goods and services will not be controlled by some sort of owners or private property owners. Those people are out. They're gone. They've been eliminated in this violent revolution. But ownership is going to revert to government. Right? And you've heard me speak often about this, haven't you? The role of government, big government versus smaller government. Obviously, this is a big government theory, a big government practice. And eventually, basically what we learn is that Marx advocates for individual ownership being completely eliminated. The concept of private property being completely eliminated. Because this automatically, ownership creates classes. And classes by their nature are unfair. That is the argument that Marx is making. Now, why is this also good? There's another reason Marx makes the argument that this is good, because everyone in society is now going to be treated equal. All right? Since there are no classes anymore, because there's no individual ownership, now everyone is truly equal. And the government has achieved this. Okay? Because they are the ownership of the means of production, but the government also is able now to treat everyone equally. Everyone will be cared for by the government. And here we have this concept of utopia again. And here is Marx advocating for what has got to be a very centralized idea. Many people draw a line from Marx. I talked about this already in this class. Marx, you draw a line back to Rousseau. You can make the argument, you can draw a line all the way back to Plato in ancient Athens and his discussion of giving up your rights to a benevolent king who's smarter and more generous than anybody else in society. And this utopia, of course, is a perfect society where everything is equal and caring. And this perfect society would basically naturally arise. And that's one of the keys I would sort of say about this, is that that's one of the aspects that Marx truly believed, that this would be natural, this would just naturally and automatically occur. Okay, now it doesn't just end right here. There's another step, and that is this utopia becomes so effective and so efficient, and equality is just accepted by everybody, that even government ownership, government control, government in and of itself could be eliminated, and that people would just control everything that they needed to control to make sure that everybody was equally cared for and taken care of. And so this is the utopia, even taking a further step. All right, now there's a lot to say about the importance of Marx, and then I'll finish off with some quotes, three of his most famous quotes. But let's talk about the importance of Karl Marx. And some of these things you may be familiar with because you're hearing them in the modern news, modern media these days. And one thing we should keep in mind is that Marx himself was never really a direct politician himself. He doesn't start personally. He doesn't lead a revolution. He's not like the Jacobins and those guys in France and people after him, the great dictators of the 20th century. Marx never did that. Sort of like Machiavelli, if you recall. Machiavelli had this great this great influence on political thought, but he never really was a politician. Much more of a philosopher. Same, I suppose you could argue with Marx, but there certainly were 20th century leaders that did. And the most famous one should be noted is Vladimir Lenin in Russia in the early 1900s, really 1917. He's the first one to create a nationwide, a nation run by communism. You may have heard of Mao Zedong in China, okay? Fidel Castro in Cuba. Maybe you've heard of Ho Chi Minh in in Vietnam, maybe if you know your American history pretty well, you know about the Vietnam War, maybe you know about the Cuban Missile Crisis. You probably should have heard of Mao. I think most of you probably heard of Lenin. Stalin is the next one that came after Lenin. But these are all guys who did what they're all Marxists, all right? And they implemented Marxist theory into the nations that they led. They had to take control violently in every situation, I might add, as well. And I would say sort of at its height, and I would sort of say this number, 1.5 billion people. You may say, big whoop, Mr. O'Brien. There's 7.5 billion people in the world today. Well, let me put it to you this way. Maybe I should write this as a percentage because I'm sort of tracking this number in the 1980s when we had 4 billion people on Earth. So you're talking about a big percent. You're talking about over 30% of the world's population. We're not quite like that today. So maybe 1.5 billion out of 4 billion people living under communism. Now you may say, well, Mr. O'Brien, China today is got 1.2 or 1.3. They almost got 1.5 billion people, and they're communists. Okay, you're right. But maybe I should put a percentage here. So I'm looking at the 1980s, about maybe 30% of the population of the Earth lived under some sort of communist system. One of the things you need to keep in mind is that there are a lot of wrong predictions. There's much of what Marx said that is completely and totally incorrect and wrong. One of those is that the poor will keep getting poorer. That was his prediction. Poor people, working class people will always get poorer. There's no way for them to get wealthier under capitalism, and that's just not the case. many working class people throughout the world, throughout time, since the writing of this book, have raised their standard of living under capitalism. Many people have been able to do that. Social mobility, in fact, is the norm under capitalism. It is not the norm, and we will see that in just a moment. Social mobility is not the norm in a communist socialist system. All right? Here's the second thing he was wrong about. He assumed that Germany would be the very first place and the logical place that a communist revolution would occur. Why? Well, it was because Germany was an industrialized nation. He saw it. Now, I have to tell you that he was kicked out of Germany, I believe at least once, maybe a couple times. He lived in London for a little while. But my point is, he was able to observe industrialization, and he thought Germany was the logical place where a communist revolution would occur. It did not occur there first, and really, I suppose you could argue that there never was a communist revolution there. Where did it start? Well, I've already sort of stated that. It started in Russia, and isn't that fascinating that if you think about Russia, much of Marx's discussions have to do with the industrialized world. Well, the fact of the matter is even by 1917, here we have the Industrial Revolution already going for 160 plus years, if you want to get down to it. Russia was really sort of one of the last European nations to industrialize. It was still mostly a rural population. But these rural peasants, as Lenin eventually called them that, we'll get into him later, he believed that they were similar. Even Marx eventually said, yeah, the Russian peasants are the same as my proletariat industrialized workers. All right? Communism did spread. There is no disputing that. But it has never become a worldwide phenomenon. It has never swept the world as Marx had hoped. And again, there was a time period where communism retreated. It's a failed policy. One of the things I would say that you could argue, why is it a failed policy, is that you would think that communism would be very popular with workers. You would think that communism would just be completely embraced by workers no matter where and no matter what. That is in fact the exact opposite of what happened. Workers in communist nations hated communism. They despised it. They thought it was a terrible system, and in most cases they rebelled against it. Why? Well, it's very simple. As I said a moment ago, any type of social mobility is completely eliminated. The prospect of prosperity. Is there an element of human nature that strives to improve themselves? Now, a communist might argue, yeah, that's true, but an individual should strive to improve everyone first before themselves. Well, maybe. But the fact of the matter is you could sort of, look, it's factual to say that there is an argument. There's a fact, the fact is that the argument exists. That it may be human nature to seek individual and personal prosperity as well. And that is completely eliminated in a communist system. And so, yes, communists who have gained leadership have in many cases maintained their leadership. But how have they maintained their power? Well, the fact of the matter is that communist leaders have only been able to maintain their power through force and terror since 1917, when Lenin implemented the first ever communist nation state, the Soviet Union. Force and terror are, without a doubt, you want to talk about factual, force and terror are in fact synonymous with communism. Now, do you have something that sort of demonstrates that to us, Mr. O'Brien? Yes, I do. And these are estimates that you can find in many places, and they are that really about, the estimates are about 100 million people in the 20th century were killed by communist leadership in the 20th century. All right? That's a lot of people. The worst killers of all, the worst of all, were Mao of China and Stalin of the Soviet Union, and then you can add up all the others, certainly in the Soviet Union and China, but in other places, even small places like Vietnam, etc., like that. All right, 100 million people killed by communist leadership and governments in the 20th century. Let's just sort of do 3 quotes to finish off. How's that sound? And maybe you recognize these. All right, here's your first one, and that is probably the greatest one of all is, "Workers of the world, unite." All right, workers of the world, unite. So I make an argument here that there's an element of, are communists necessarily nationalistic? In other words, are they interested in their nation? Are they interested in, or dare I say, what is Marx saying? Marx is saying that a communist should not be nationalistic. A communist should not be patriotic, because that's not what he's interested in. Marx is interested in the world having all these things I just described, this workers' revolution. It shouldn't just happen in one nation. Yeah, it'd have to go through Germany and the Russians, but eventually it's got to be a world revolution. Generally, communists are not, in an ideal sense, Marx would say communists should not be patriotic to a nation. We will discover that in fact, communist leaders are in fact very nationalistic. Here's the next one. This is the longer one. He said, "From each according to their ability, to each according to their need." This is another one of the famous lines. And you can see here, look, I think it's important to make a note here that the concept of redistribution of wealth ultimately is a communist thought process. And where does that come from? That comes from socialism. There is no disputing the fact that communism is a big branch of socialism, and the redistribution of wealth and the increase in the size of government and creating equal outcomes. Remember, the right side of the political spectrum believes in equal opportunities. This is the equal outcome side. And so, yes, this is an appeal for voluntary, maybe, to do this. All of you, each with ability, should give to each in need. But don't dispute the fact that this also could imply we're going to find anybody with ability and take from them what we want and give to those who we perceive being in need. All right? So you certainly see redistribution of wealth, socialism right there. Okay, so the next one is, "Religion is the opiate of the masses." This is the last one. I'll leave you with this. Religion is the opiate of the masses. What does this mean? Well, you see the word opiate here, and this has to do with a drug called opium. And opium is, I don't know exactly what kind of drug it is, but it's sort of, you lose feelings. It's a relaxation drug for those people who use that stuff. It also numbs pain, doesn't it? All right, so now, what is the implication here? If you think about what this means is what does opium do? Opium numbs pain so you don't have to worry about it for a while. Okay? So now what is he making the argument? He is making the argument that religion is something that can numb the pain. It can make you feel better, and while the drug will wear off and you'll eventually feel bad again, religion is not really truthful, and eventually you'll feel bad again. And so the masses who are miserable, what have they turned to help them live their lives? They've turned to religion, and ultimately it makes them feel better for a little while. But Marx does not like religion because he says this delays, this opiate, this drug of religion delays the realization that the masses need to reach to ultimately have their workers' revolution. So religion is bad. And I can tell you that Marx, and we learned this about Marx when we studied Hitler, didn't we? And that is that Karl Marx was Jewish. And Hitler often used that argument about the Soviet Union, that the communists of the Soviet Union were Jewish guys and founded by Jews. Well, the fact of the matter is that Karl Marx hated religion. He rejected his own Jewish background. He wanted nothing to do with it, and wanted nothing to do with religion himself, and certainly wanted nothing to do with, he wanted the masses to have nothing to do with religion either. Okay? All right, so as you listen to current events and you listen to current events discussions and you hear Marxism brought up, keep in mind what you're listening to. I'll just throw one last thing at you here, and that is that Karl Marx was very much anti-family, even though he had a wife from a very wealthy family, and his wife's family basically supported him financially along with Friedrich Engels for much of his life. And yes, he did have a couple of children. Generally, Karl Marx and Marxists generally are anti-family. Because why? Why would Marx be anti-family? It's very simple. What does somebody say about why they need so much? Why would somebody say, well, I need all this money that I'm making. I need all this money that I'm making because I have a family and I want to take care of my family. So I need to make a lot of money to take care of my family. And so Marx and Marxists and communists look at that and they say, well, that's no good, because we need to, as you can see, what do we need to do with every individual's financial wherewithal, their private property, to take care of it? We're going to need to take it and give it to those in need. So how do we solve this problem for somebody giving the excuse that they have to make so much money, they need so much private property, they need so much to ownership that they have to support their family? What is the solution? Well, we eliminate the family. Well, who takes care of children? The government, the state. The state takes care of your children. Yes, a man and a woman have to get together to have children, but who's going to take care of the children? Not that man and woman, but the state itself. And that solves the problem, the argument that someone might make about, I need to make a lot of money to support my family. Communists say, no more family. All right, everyone? Okay, I hope you found that interesting and enlightening. I hope that you enjoyed the discussion and it made you think. All right, see you next time. Aloha.